It always starts with something small, something that should have been left alone, something that never should have been blown out of proportion. In neighborhoods governed by HOAs, every detail can become a battleground, and for one quiet homeowner, the spark came in the form of a fence. Not a broken fence, not an eyesore, not even a dangerous one, just a simple wooden fence standing on his property, doing its job of providing privacy and keeping his yard defined. But to Karen, the neighbor across the street who had built her identity around the HOA rulebook, that fence represented defiance. It was taller than the average picket fences that lined the block, taller than the HOA's vision of uniform neatness. While the homeowner had measured, checked regulations, and stayed within the acceptable range, Karen decided it was too high for her liking. She had become the self-appointed enforcer of everything aesthetic in the community, and once her eyes locked on the fence, she began the campaign. The first signs were subtle. Karen was seen pacing along the sidewalk, staring at the fence with narrowed eyes, her phone angled just so as she snapped photos. She muttered loudly when other neighbors passed, commenting that some people just don't care about community standards. Soon the whispers began to circulate, fueled by her constant calls to the HOA office. She claimed it obstructed her view. She argued it would set a precedent, that soon everyone would raise fences until the neighborhood looked like a fortress. She insisted that it violated the spirit of the HOA's aesthetic rules, even if not the letter. The homeowner at first brushed it off. After all, the fence wasn't hurting anyone, but HOA politics rarely die quietly, and Karen was relentless. Within weeks, official letters began arriving in the mail. Thin envelopes stamped with the HOA insignia, containing stiffly worded warnings about compliance. The letters accused him of compromising the uniform appearance of the community. They demanded he lower the fence or face fines. Frustration bubbled beneath the surface. The fence had been built legally, permitted, and approved by local zoning codes. Yet the HOA, armed with Karen's complaints, acted as though it were a crime. The more he read the letters, the more he saw Karen's fingerprints all over them. This was not a community-wide issue. This was personal. Neighbors began to take sides. Some quietly admitted they liked the fence, appreciating the privacy it inspired. Others shrugged and said they didn't care. But Karen gathered her loyal few, the ones who thrived on gossip and control, and together they made it their mission to bring the fence down. They showed up at board meetings, stacking the agenda with complaints. They exaggerated their grievances, saying the fence cast shadows on neighboring yards, made the street feel closed off, and even suggested it lowered property values. Meanwhile, the homeowner grew tired of the constant harassment. He wasn't one to pick fights, but the letters kept coming, the fines grew larger, and the principle of it all began to sting. Why should a perfectly legal fence cause so much uproar? Why should Karen, a single neighbor with too much time on her hands, dictate what could stand on his property? The tipping point came one summer afternoon. He found a fresh notice taped directly to the fence, written not by the HOA but clearly by Karen herself. Scrawled in bold letters, it demanded immediate removal for the good of the neighborhood. It wasn't official, but it carried the arrogance of someone who thought she ran the block. That was the moment when annoyance transformed into resolve. He would not lower his fence. He would not bow to pressure. Instead, he began to think bigger. If Karen hated his fence for being too high, what would she think if it wasn't just a fence anymore? What if it became something she could never ignore, something so bold and undeniable that her complaints would collapse under their own weight? The idea began small, but as he sat staring at the wooden planks, the vision grew in scale. He imagined stone, turrets, battlements, a wall that wasn't just a barrier, but a statement, something that looked less like a suburban divider and more like a medieval castle boundary. The thought amused him at first, a daydream of playful revenge, but the more Karen harassed, the stronger the idea took root. He researched architectural designs, browsing photos of fortress-style walls and historic castles. He discovered that, with the right materials, it was entirely possible to construct something sturdy and impressive while still technically fitting into the zoning requirements. Days turned into weeks as the plan formed. Contractors were consulted, permits were verified, and every legal loophole was noted. If Karen wanted a war over appearances, Then appearances were exactly what she would get. He envisioned not just a wall but a spectacle, a structure so undeniably bold that the entire neighborhood would stop and stare. Meanwhile, Karen grew smug, believing her pressure campaign was working. At HOA meetings, she declared that the unsightly fence would soon come down, boasting that enforcement was inevitable. She relished the nods of agreement from her small circle, painting herself as the savior of neighborhood order. She didn't realize that behind the scenes, plans were already underway for something far larger than she ever imagined. The first sign of change came with the arrival of construction equipment. Trucks rolled in, unloading pallets of stone and stacks of heavy timber. Workers marked measurements around the yard, digging deeper foundations than anyone had seen for a simple fence. Neighbors gathered, curious and confused. Karen watched from across the street, suspicion etched on her face, but even she didn't yet grasp the scale. The homeowner kept quiet, allowing the work to speak for itself. Each day the structure grew higher, layer by layer, stone by stone. What had once been a plain wooden fence evolved into a looming wall. Turret-like corners began to take shape. Archways framed the gate, and the details hinted unmistakably at medieval inspiration. It wasn't just a fence anymore, it was a fortress rising from suburban soil. By the time the wall reached half its height, whispers turned into buzz. The neighborhood couldn't stop talking. Children pointed and laughed, imagining knights and dragons. Adults marveled at the audacity. Even those who sided with Karen secretly admired the craftsmanship. The wall was unlike anything the subdivision had ever seen. It was bold, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. Karen, however, erupted. Her complaints escalated into daily tirades. She called the HOA, the city inspectors, even the police. She waved her phone around, recording the construction as though capturing evidence of a crime. But each official visit ended the same way. The permits were valid. The design, while unconventional, met the requirements. No laws were broken. The more she screamed, the more powerless she seemed. The homeowner, meanwhile, relished the growing spectacle. Every stone laid was a victory. Every complaint dismissed was another point scored. What began as an act of defiance became a neighborhood event. The wall rose higher, broader, stronger. Its presence transformed the yard into something resembling a medieval stronghold, complete with decorative battlements that peeked over the rooftops. By the time it was complete, the simple dispute over a fence had become legend. Where once there had been a plain wooden boundary, now stood a castle wall. Its shadow stretched across the street, a constant reminder of the feud that sparked it. Some neighbors laughed, others rolled their eyes, but everyone agreed on one thing: Karen had lost control. But Karen was not one to give up easily. She saw the wall not as a defeat, but as an insult, a challenge to her authority. Her fury burned brighter than ever, and while the homeowner admired his creation, Karen plotted her next move. The battle wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. And so, as the sun set behind the newly built fortress wall, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. What would Karen do next? How far would she go to tear down what she could no longer ignore? The stage was set, the feud was alive, and the story of the castle wall was only getting started. The weeks following the arrival of the contractors were a spectacle in themselves. It was one thing to imagine a simple fence being raised in a suburban neighborhood. It was entirely another to watch heavy-duty equipment arrive, as though preparing for a full-scale construction project. The workers, they dressed in their neon vests and hard hats, moved with purposeful rhythm. The sound of cement mixers churned through the quiet cul-de-sac. Large deliveries of stone blocks, timbers, and wrought-iron fixtures turned the once ordinary driveway into something resembling a medieval construction yard. The neighbors were not prepared for what they were about to witness. Initially, many assumed the new project would be no more than an overcompensated fence, perhaps an 8-foot structure at most. Something tall, perhaps heavy in design, but still in line with suburban norms. That illusion shattered the moment the first pallets of quarried stone were dropped onto the front lawn. These were not panels of vinyl or simple wooden planks. These were massive stones, rough-hewn and weathered, giving off the impression of an old-world fortress wall. The first layer was laid in a precise line along the property boundary. The workers built slowly, methodically, digging trenches deep enough to anchor the enormous weight of what was to come. Mortar filled the gaps, and steel rods reinforced the rising structure. By the end of the first week, a wall shoulder high to most adults was already standing tall, stretching across the length of the yard. And yet, it was only the beginning. Karen, of course, was beside herself. The sight of a wall that thick and heavy in appearance was enough to drive her into a frenzy. She had thought she could intimidate with paperwork and ordinances, but now she was staring down something she had never anticipated. Neighbors whispered that she stood on the sidewalk for hours, arms crossed, snapping photos and taking notes as though preparing a legal case. But every photo captured only the legitimacy of the project. Every delivery truck carried stamped permits. Every worker moved under licensed authority. The wall was not a violation. It was a monument rising in plain sight. By the second week, the fortress began to take on its identity. The stone wall stretched higher, surpassing the height of any fence in the neighborhood. Iron reinforcements shaped into Gothic-like railings were installed at the top of the stonework, to giving the appearance of battlements. It wasn't just tall, it was imposing. The design drew heavily on medieval architecture, arched crenellations, recessed arrow-slit windows purely decorative, and torches fitted with LED bulbs for nighttime illumination. The cul-de-sac transformed into an unintended tourist attraction. Cars slowed down to gape at the wall. Delivery drivers stopped to snap photos. Strangers who had no business in the neighborhood wandered down the street just to catch a glimpse of the suburban fortress. Children whispered that it looked like a castle, while adults muttered that it looked like trouble. Regardless of the opinion, the wall commanded attention in a way no typical fence ever could. Meanwhile, life inside the fortress grounds became a private sanctuary. For the homeowner, the wall represented security, peace, and a buffer against constant complaints. What was once a simple backyard was now enclosed in a cloister of stone, muffling noise and shielding against prying eyes. Within those walls, the yard seemed quieter, the air calmer. The world outside still bustled with petty drama, but it no longer reached within. Karen, however, did not relent. She stormed HOA meetings, waving her papers and demanding the wall be torn down. She complained to city officials, only to be told that the permits were valid. She wrote letters, filed grievances, and even attempted to rally the neighbors against what she described as an unsightly monstrosity. But in truth, many neighbors secretly admired the audacity. They too had felt the suffocating grip of petty complaints and unreasonable restrictions. To see someone push back so boldly and so legally was a form of quiet vindication. By the third month, the wall was complete, and it was not just a wall, it was a landmark. Towers, small but striking, had been incorporated at the corners. Each tower rose slightly higher than the wall itself, with conical tops mimicking those of medieval keeps. The gates were wrought iron, heavy and ornate, swinging open with a creak that echoed in the quiet neighborhood. Carved crests decorated the entry, symbols of personal pride turned into architectural flourish. At night, subtle uplighting illuminated the stone, casting dramatic shadows across the cul-de-sac. It was no longer a fence line, it was a statement. The transformation affected the entire neighborhood. Real estate agents whispered that property values were either threatened or strangely elevated depending on one's perspective. Some saw the fortress as an eyesore that would deter buyers. Others argued it was a curiosity that might draw more interest. Regardless, no one could ignore its presence. Even aerial photos of the neighborhood now showed the fortress clearly, a single defiant mark in an otherwise uniform community. Karen, humiliated but undeterred, escalated her campaign. She began spreading rumors. She claimed the wall was unsafe, that it would collapse in a storm. She said it violated the spirit of the neighborhood. She even suggested it was a hazard to children, though no children were ever allowed inside the fortress grounds without permission. But every claim she made dissolved under scrutiny. Engineers had signed off on the project. Inspectors had passed every phase of construction. The structure was sound, safe, and unassailable, both physically and legally. This only deepened her frustration. What had begun as a simple complaint about fence height had now spiraled into something beyond her control. Instead of asserting dominance, she had become the center of mockery. Neighbors rolled their eyes when she brought it up. Online forums dedicated to HOA horror stories caught wind of the saga, and soon the fortress was not just a local curiosity, but an internet sensation. Pictures of the suburban castle wall circulated widely, often accompanied by captions celebrating the homeowner's defiance against Karen-like behavior. And yet, for all the noise, life within the fortress remained calm. The thick stone muted the sound of traffic, arguments, and gossip. The yard became a private garden, shaded and protected, a haven unlike any other in the cul-de-sac. While the outside world buzzed with Karen's outrage, inside the wall there was only peace. But peace, as it often does, was temporary. The fortress had stirred something larger than one neighbor's complaints. With its notoriety spreading and Karen's obsession deepening, new tensions began to surface. The HOA, embarrassed by the viral attention, quietly began drafting new ordinances to prevent similar constructions in the future. Karen herself, unwilling to admit defeat, hinted at new tactics, new angles, new ways to chip away at what she could not control. The fortress stood tall, immovable, and secure, but its existence had shifted the balance in the neighborhood forever. And as the final stones settled and the torches flickered to life in the evening air, it became clear that this was no longer just a battle over a fence. It was a war of persistence, of pride, and of power, a war that was far from finished. The fortress stood completed, stone and iron casting shadows that stretched across the cul-de-sac each evening. To anyone passing by, it was more than a fence. It was a symbol, a monument to defiance, endurance, and stubborn pride. To most of the neighbors, it became part of the scenery, a curiosity that eventually blended into their daily routines. But to Karen, it was a wound that never healed. Each time she looked at the towering walls next door, she saw not just stone but her own defeat. She had spent years building her reputation as the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood order. She had monitored lawns, measured hedges, scrutinized trash bins left out too long. She thrived on rules, on limits, on her own interpretation of what community spirit meant. And now that authority had been shattered by a wall she could not break, a structure that followed every regulation to the letter while making a mockery of her control. Her resentment grew with each passing day. The fortress was no longer just a private project, it was a public humiliation. Online forums had christened it the Castle Karen built against her will. Thousands of strangers cheered the defiance, posting memes of suburban nights and photoshopped drawbridges. The homeowner had not sought fame, but fame had found the wall regardless. For Karen, the attention was unbearable. She had intended to stop offense. Instead, she had become a cautionary tale for petty interference. But Karen was not finished. In the months after the wall's completion, she shifted her strategy. Where direct complaints had failed, she sought alliances. She rallied sympathetic board members within the HOA, appealing to their fear of precedent. What if, she argued, every homeowner built something so absurd? What would become of the neighborhood's character, its property values, its sense of order? Though many board members privately admired the sheer audacity of the fortress, they could not ignore the pressure. Meetings grew tense. Discussions circled around aesthetic integrity and community standards. Drafts of new ordinances circulated quietly, rules aimed not at tearing down the existing wall, but at ensuring no future walls like it could ever rise again. Still, Karen wanted more than prevention. She wanted destruction. She searched for loopholes, flaws, anything that might undo what had already been built. She claimed the lighting violated brightness restrictions, though inspectors found it acceptable. She complained about noise, though the fortress was silent. She suggested the stonework attracted pests, though no evidence was found. Each attempt fell flat, yet each failure only hardened her obsession. The tension spread beyond HOA meetings. Neighbors, weary of the endless conflict, began taking sides. Some viewed the fortress as a triumph of individuality, a stand against overreach. Others whispered that the wall had cursed the street with endless arguments and declining harmony. A once peaceful cul-de-sac was now a battleground of opinion, its quiet streets carrying undercurrents of rivalry. And then came the storm. One autumn night, Fierce winds tore through the town. Branches snapped, power lines shook, roof shingles scattered like leaves. In the morning, our residents emerged to assess the damage. Fences were toppled, siding was ripped, and debris littered every yard. Yet amid the wreckage, the fortress stood untouched. The heavy stone had not shifted. The iron gates remained closed. The torches flickered back to life as though nothing had happened. For some, this was proof of its strength, its wisdom. For Karen, it was another humiliation. Not even nature could undermine it. If anything, the storm made the fortress seem even more invincible. But storms have a way of stirring more than wind. The HOA seized the moment. While cleanup dominated the neighborhood, new ordinances were rushed into effect under the guise of storm preparedness. Restrictions on exterior structures, height limitations, and aesthetic guidelines were tightened to suffocating levels. These rules, though not retroactive, were a clear shot across the bow. Never again would a fortress rise in this community. The fortress remained, but it was to stand as the first and last of its kind. Karen wanted more. In her desperation, she filed one final complaint. This time not with the HOA, but with City Hall itself. She claimed the fortress, though permitted, represented a public hazard in its scale and style. She argued it could attract trespassers, vandals, or even create blind spots dangerous for traffic. She requested a review of its legality, a reconsideration of the permits already granted. It was her last gambit, a gamble that higher authority might succeed where neighborhood bureaucracy had failed. City inspectors returned. They walked the perimeter, measured dimensions, checked reinforcement, studied the permits, and left without ceremony. Weeks later, the letter arrived. The verdict was final. The fortress was fully compliant. There would be no removal, no fines, no dismantling. It was not just legal, it was exemplary in its construction. Karen's last card had been played, and it crumbled in her hand. The story might have ended there. Walls standing, neighbor defeated, peace restored. But something deeper had shifted. The fortress had become more than stone and iron. It had become folklore. Online, the saga grew. Videos documenting the build reached millions. Commentators dissected every step, using it as a parable for standing up to pettiness. The phrase, "build a castle wall," slipped into internet slang, shorthand for turning a complaint into an overwhelming response. Tourists, in their own strange way, began driving through the neighborhood just to glimpse the infamous suburban fortress. It became a landmark, whispered about in faraway forums as though it were a myth come to life. Within the neighborhood, grudges lingered but softened. Some residents who once resented the wall came to appreciate its quiet grandeur. Others simply grew tired of conflict and accepted it as permanent. Children, who once whispered about its strangeness, began to imagine it as a place of adventure, a castle in their own backyard stories. Over time, the wall was no longer just the wall. It was part of the neighborhood's identity. Karen, however, never accepted it. To her dying day in that cul-de-sac, she saw the fortress not as a landmark, but as a scar. Her yard remained meticulously kept, her rules enforced where she could still enforce them. Yet the fortress loomed always in her view, an unmovable reminder that her power had limits. She had fought a battle she could never win, and in losing, she had defined herself by the very wall she despised. The homeowner, meanwhile, lived quietly within the sanctuary. Behind the stone, life moved on. Seasons passed, gardens grew, evenings remained calm. The wall, at its core, had done its job. It kept the world at bay, silenced the noise, and preserved the peace within. And so the saga closed. What began as a complaint about a fence too high became a story of defiance turned legend. A suburban street gained its own castle, not because of grand ambition, but because of relentless pettiness, met with relentless determination. In the end, the fortress stood not just as a wall of stone, but as a testament, a reminder that sometimes the harder you push someone down, the taller they will build in return. And so on that quiet cul-de-sac, long after the arguments faded, the fortress remained, unchallenged, unbroken, unforgotten,